By 1945, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively against Imperial Japan. The once mighty Japanese Empire, which had swept across Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed in 1941 and 1942, now found itself on the defensive across every front. The string of devastating defeats that began at Midway in June 1942 had continued relentlessly. Japanese garrisons, often isolated and cut off from resupply, watched helplessly as American forces drew ever closer to the home islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding U.S. Pacific Fleet operations, had refined a strategy that would become known as island hopping or leapfrogging. Rather than attempting to recapture every Japanese-held island in the vast Pacific, American forces would seize only those locations deemed strategically critical. The remaining Japanese garrisons would be bypassed, left to wither on the vine, isolated and impotent, while the American juggernaut rolled westward toward Japan itself. This approach conserved American lives and accelerated the timetable for bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. The progression of American conquests told the story of Japan's crumbling defensive perimeter. In November 1943, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The battle proved shockingly brutal, with nearly 1,000 Marines killed in just 76 hours of fighting on an island barely 2 miles long. The American public, seeing the casualties from such a tiny speck of coral, began to understand the terrible price that would be paid for victory in the Pacific. The lessons learned at Tarawa about amphibious operations, naval gunfire support, and Japanese defensive tactics would prove invaluable in the battles to come. February 1944 brought the conquest of the Marshall Islands, pushing the American advance another 1,000 miles closer to Japan. Then came the Marianas Campaign in June 1944, with the seizure of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands, though purchased at terrible cost, provided something of immense strategic value: air bases within range of the Japanese home islands. From these bases, the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo and other major Japanese cities. The loss of the Marianas dealt Japan a psychological blow so severe that it triggered the resignation of Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. The progression of American conquests told the story of Japan's crumbling defensive perimeter. In September 1944, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Peleliu, demonstrated just how costly these island battles could become. What American planners optimistically predicted would be a 4-day operation instead devoured 11 weeks and thousands of casualties. The Japanese defenders, learning from their earlier defeats, had abandoned the tactic of meeting the Americans on the beaches. Instead, they constructed elaborate cave systems and fortifications in the island's interior, turning Peleliu into a killing ground where every yard had to be purchased with blood. American strategists now turned their attention to Iwo Jima, a volcanic island so small and desolate it seemed barely worth notice. The island measured only 7.2 kilometers in length and varied from 800 meters to 4 kilometers in width, an insignificant speck in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Its landscape was dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 166-meter extinct volcano at the island's southern tip, while volcanic ash and rock covered the rest of the terrain. There were no trees, no fresh water sources, and the island's only inhabitants were military personnel and a small number of civilians who would be evacuated before the battle. Yet Iwo Jima possessed strategic significance far beyond its size. Positioned almost exactly halfway between Tokyo and the new American air bases in the Marianas, the island served as an early warning station for the Japanese, allowing them to alert Tokyo of incoming B-29 raids. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima's 2 operational airfields regularly harassed the Marianas bases. For the Americans, capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate this threat while providing a vital support base for their strategic bombing campaign. B-29s damaged over Japan could make emergency landings there. Long-range P-51 Mustang fighters could use it as a staging point to escort bombers all the way to Tokyo. Search and rescue operations could be based there to save downed air crews. Perhaps most significantly from the American perspective, Iwo Jima was legally part of the Tokyo Prefecture, actual Japanese sovereign territory, not a conquered possession. Its capture would mark the first time since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century that foreign troops occupied Japanese soil. American planners hoped this would deliver a severe psychological blow to Japanese civilian morale. The mission to capture Iwo Jima, codenamed Operation Detachment, fell to the United States Marine Corps' V Amphibious Corps, commanded by Major General Harry Schmidt. The force assembled for this operation was staggering in its scope. 3 full Marine divisions totaling over 70,000 combat troops, supported by another 30,000 Navy personnel manning the invasion fleet. The 3rd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Graves Erskine, would serve initially as the floating reserve. The 4th Marine Division, under Major General Clifton Cates, would assault the eastern beaches. The 5th Marine Division, led by Major General Keller Rocky, would strike the western beaches. Supporting this armada were nearly 500 ships of various types, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft, plus over 200 additional vessels providing logistics support. American intelligence estimated Japanese strength on Iwo Jima at approximately 13,000 troops. They were wrong. The actual defending force numbered 21,000 men of the 109th Infantry Division, reinforced by naval personnel and other units. But more significant than the numbers was the commander, Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi, one of Japan's most capable and innovative officers. Kuribayashi was an unusual figure in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had served as a military attaché in the United States during the 1920s and traveled extensively throughout the country. Unlike many of his peers, he understood American industrial capacity and the futility of Japan's war. He had opposed war with the United States, but once it began, dedicated himself to defending every inch of Japanese territory with maximum effectiveness. Kuribayashi had studied the previous island battles intensely, particularly the recent carnage at Peleliu, and he understood that Japanese defensive tactics needed to evolve. Traditional Japanese doctrine called for meeting the enemy at the water's edge, defending the beaches at all costs. When positions became untenable, Japanese commanders typically ordered suicidal banzai charges, mass frontal assaults that might briefly break enemy lines, but ultimately served only to waste troops and deliver victory to the enemy more quickly. Kuribayashi rejected both approaches. He would allow the Marines to come ashore, then grind them down through attritional warfare from fortified positions. Upon arriving on Iwo Jima in June 1944, Kuribayashi immediately began transforming the island into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had yet encountered. He divided the island into 5 sectors, with primary defensive belts in the north, where the terrain favored the defense. His engineers constructed a network of tunnels, caves, and bunkers that would become legendary for its complexity and durability. Some tunnel systems ran 3 levels deep. The tunnels connected firing positions, allowing defenders to shift positions, evacuate damaged strongpoints, and launch attacks from unexpected directions. The fortifications themselves ranged from simple spider holes for snipers to massive reinforced concrete blockhouses with walls several feet thick. Gun positions were expertly camouflaged and provided mutually supporting fields of fire. Artillery pieces, mortars, and rockets were positioned with pre-registered firing coordinates for every approach route and potential landing beach. Tanks were dug into revetments, becoming stationary pillboxes. Kurebayashi even positioned weapons in the rubble of destroyed buildings, knowing the Americans would assume such areas had been neutralized. Kurebayashi issued his courageous battle vows to every man under his command. These instructions fundamentally changed Japanese defensive doctrine. No banzai charges would be permitted. Every position would be defended to the last man. Each soldier was ordered to kill 10 enemies before dying. Wounded soldiers, unable to fight, would take their own lives rather than burden their comrades. Retreat was forbidden. As Kurebayashi told his men, they should think of their defensive positions as their graves. The American pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16th, 3 days before the scheduled landing. Naval vessels and aircraft pounded the island, but the bombardment was far shorter than Marine commanders wanted. General Schmidt had requested 10 days of sustained bombardment to systematically destroy Japanese fortifications. The Navy granted only 3 days, concerned about fuel consumption, ammunition supplies, and the vulnerability of ships to kamikaze attacks. This decision would have deadly consequences. The bombardment, while spectacular to watch, proved largely ineffective. Most shells exploded on the surface or buried themselves in volcanic ash before detonating. The deeply buried Japanese positions remained largely intact. Kurebayashi ordered his troops to remain in their shelters and not return fire, preserving both men and ammunition while allowing the Americans to believe the bombardment had been effective. February 19, 1945, D-Day, dawned clear and cold. At 0645 hours, the naval bombardment intensified to a crescendo. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers hurled thousands of shells at the landing beaches and visible targets. At 8:30 hours, the bombardment lifted, and the first wave of Marines scrambled down cargo nets into their landing craft. The beach had been divided into 7 color-coded sections: green beach and red beaches 1 and 2 in the west, yellow beaches 1 and 2 in the center, and blue beaches 1 and 2 in the east. At 900 hours, the first Marines hit the beaches. The initial moments seemed almost anticlimactic. Japanese fire was sporadic and light. Marines poured ashore from their Amtraks, amphibious tracked vehicles that could navigate from ship to shore. The men expected a storm of fire, but instead found themselves struggling against an unexpected enemy, the island itself. Iwo Jima's beaches weren't sand, but volcanic ash, loose and treacherous. Men sank ankle-deep with every step. The ash provided no firm footing, turning every movement into exhausting labor. Tracked vehicles bogged down or struggled for traction. Wheeled vehicles couldn't gain purchase at all. Worst of all, approximately 15 meters inland from the waterline rose a terrace of volcanic ash and debris, nearly 5 meters high in places. This natural obstacle, underestimated in pre-invasion planning, formed a barrier that stopped tanks and vehicles cold. The Marines had been ashore for approximately 30 minutes, with follow-on waves continuing to pour troops and equipment onto the beaches, when Kurebayashi's trap snapped shut. From hundreds of hidden positions across the island, Japanese artillery, mortars, and rockets opened fire simultaneously. The landing beaches had been pre-registered with precise coordinates. Japanese observers on Mount Suribachi and in the highlands had perfect observation of every square meter of the beaches. The result was carnage. Shells burst among the densely packed Marines, each explosion sending showers of metal fragments and volcanic ash in every direction. Men were killed or wounded by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Landing craft bringing fresh waves were hit before they could reach shore, their loads of men killed in an instant. Disabled vehicles blocked movement. The wounded accumulated faster than corpsmen could treat them. Blood mixed with the black volcanic ash, creating a macabre mud. Compounding the nightmare, Japanese machine guns positioned in Mount Suribachi's slopes now opened fire, raking the beaches from the southern flank. But the heaviest fire came from the extreme right of the landing zone, from a depression in the cliffs that would become known simply as the quarry. This position, a former mining excavation, provided the Japanese with a fortified position that overlooked the entire eastern beach sector. Marines advancing inland on the right flank were caught in a murderous crossfire. Major General Clifton Cates, commanding the 4th Marine Division responsible for that sector, had worried about this exact scenario. Before the invasion, he had remarked prophetically that if he knew the name of the Marine on the extreme right of his rightmost unit, he would recommend that man for a medal in advance, knowing the hell he would face. Despite the devastating fire, the Marines pushed forward with grim determination. Combat engineers brought bulldozers to the volcanic terrace and began cutting paths through it, working under fire that killed many of them. By 10:30 hours, the first vehicles were able to move inland from the beaches. The 5th Marine Division on the left began pushing toward the western shore, intending to cut the island in two and isolate Mount Suribachi. The 4th Marine Division on the right struggled toward the first objective, Airfield No. 1, located approximately 500 meters from the beach. Meanwhile, the 28th Marine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Harry Liversedge, received the mission of taking Mount Suribachi. This extinct volcano dominated the southern third of the island, and Japanese observers on its slopes could see everything happening on the beaches. The mountain had to be taken, but it bristled with fortifications. Liversedge's initial report captured the situation tersely. Troops ashore and moving to isolate volcano. Resistance moderate, but terrain awful. By nightfall on D-Day, over 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima, but the beachhead remained perilously shallow. Only in the west had Marines reached the opposite shore, and even there, the gap was barely 700 meters wide. Airfield No. 1 remained in Japanese hands. Mount Suribachi loomed over everything, unconquered. Casualties already exceeded 2,400, including over 500 dead. Worse, only about a third of the first day's objectives had been secured. Original plans called for the entire southern third of the island to be in American hands by nightfall, with the 28th Marines already scaling Suribachi. The stark reality was that Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was working exactly as intended. The Americans were ashore, but they were bleeding heavily for every meter of ground. The night of February 19th to 20th brought a new terror, the possibility of Japanese counterattacks. In previous island battles, the Japanese had regularly launched nighttime assaults, often infiltrating American lines to sow chaos. Every Marine along the perimeter stared into the darkness, expecting waves of Japanese soldiers to come pouring out of the night. But Kuribayashi had forbidden such attacks, knowing they wasted troops who could kill more Americans by defending prepared positions. As dawn broke on February 20th, D+1, the Marines resumed their advance. The 28th Regiment pushed forward to encircle Mount Suribachi completely, cutting it off from the rest of the island. Patrols probed the volcano's slopes, discovering a nightmare of fortifications. The Japanese had transformed Suribachi into a fortress honeycomb with caves and tunnels. Over 70 reinforced concrete bunkers and pillboxes dotted its slopes, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns were emplaced in tiny apertures, nearly invisible until they opened fire. Artillery pieces fired from cave mouths, then were withdrawn on rails before American counter-battery fire could destroy them. In the center of the island, Marines pushed across the rubble-strewn wasteland of Airfield No. 1. This airfield, the first of 3 the Japanese had constructed, was cratered from the bombardment, but still recognizable. Its capture would be a significant achievement, but the Japanese contested every meter. Hidden positions erupted with fire, cutting down Marines who had thought an area secure. On the eastern flank, the 4th Marine Division continued its bloody struggle against the quarry. This fortified position proved nearly impregnable. Marines attacking it faced not only fire from the quarry itself, but from positions further north that could support it. Small unit leaders, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, led repeated assaults, only to be cut down. Companies that had landed with 240 men found themselves reduced to 50 or 60 effectives within hours. The volcanic ash that covered everything made tactical movement nearly impossible. Men trying to dig foxholes found the ash collapsing back into the holes as fast as they could excavate it. As the battle continued, Kuribayashi issued orders intended to stiffen his troops' resolve. Each man should think of his defense position as his graveyard, fight until the last, and inflict much damage to the enemy. For the Japanese soldiers huddled in their bunkers and caves, the message was clear. No one was leaving Iwo Jima alive. All that mattered was killing as many Americans as possible before dying. February 21, D+2, brought an unexpected enemy, the weather. A storm system moved in, bringing rain, high winds, and rough seas. The invasion beaches, already difficult to work on, became a quagmire of black volcanic mud. Supplies couldn't be unloaded efficiently. Wounded men waited hours for evacuation to the hospital ships. The rain mixed with volcanic ash to create a sticky substance that clung to clothing, fouled weapons, and made movement even more difficult than before. Offshore, Japanese kamikaze aircraft attacked the invasion fleet. These suicide planes, packed with explosives and piloted by volunteers on one-way missions, had become an increasingly common threat. One kamikaze struck the escort carrier USS Bismarck C, triggering explosions that sank the ship with the loss of over 200 sailors. Other kamikazes damaged multiple vessels. The attack served as a reminder that even though the Marines were ashore, the battle was far from won. On the island itself, the grinding advance continued despite the weather. In the west, where the terrain was relatively flat, the 5th Marine Division made better progress. Tanks could operate more effectively here, providing critical fire support for infantry assaults. Marines advanced several hundred meters, pushing toward the island's western shore. But in the east, progress remained agonizingly slow. The quarry continued to exact a terrible toll. One company of 240 Marines found itself reduced to just 18 men still capable of fighting. The survivors, exhausted and traumatized, were pulled off the line, and the unit effectively ceased to exist. By the end of D+2, American casualties had reached approximately 5,300, including over 1,000 dead. These losses exceeded the worst predictions. At this rate of attrition, the entire invasion force could be bled white before securing the island. General Schmidt made the difficult decision to commit his reserve force ahead of schedule. The 3rd Marine Division, which had been held afloat in case of emergency, received orders to begin landing. The rain continued through February 22, D+3, turning the volcanic sand into a sticky, clinging substance that Marines soon learned to hate. It mixed with rain and sweat to form a paste that coated everything. Weapons had to be constantly cleaned to prevent malfunctions. The 28th Regiment reported, "Bad weather and poor visibility throughout the day hampered our operations considerably. The rain mixed with volcanic dust caused stoppages in practically all automatic weapons, reducing them to single-shot capability." Automatic weapons, machine guns, Browning automatic rifles, were crucial for suppressing Japanese positions. Reducing them to single-shot capability significantly reduced American firepower. Despite the conditions, the Marines pressed forward. The 28th Regiment tightened its grip on Mount Suribachi, with patrols pushing higher up the volcano's slopes. Flamethrowers proved particularly effective against the cave positions. Teams would approach a cave entrance, spray it with jellied gasoline, and ignite it. The flames would be sucked deep into the cave system by ventilation, incinerating defenders or consuming all the oxygen and suffocating them. Elsewhere on the island, Marines began probing Kuribayashi's main defensive belt in the north. This prepared defense zone incorporated the island's most rugged terrain, rocky highlands, deep ravines, and broken ground that channeled attackers into killing zones. Japanese engineers had months to prepare these positions, and it showed. Every approach was covered by multiple weapons. Bunkers were constructed with walls over a meter thick. Some positions were connected by tunnels 15 meters underground, too deep for Arakan artillery to collapse. The sophistication of Japanese defenses amazed and horrified the Marines. Some bunkers were massive structures, virtually underground fortresses. They included barracks, command posts, ammunition magazines, and even hospitals. Ventilation systems brought in fresh air. Some positions had multiple levels, with defenders able to move between floors via internal staircases. Electrical generators provided lighting. Kitchens allowed defenders to prepare hot meals. Japanese soldier Tsurugi Akikusa, who survived the battle, later described one such position. The Southern Islands Naval Air Station headquarters bunker was the largest bunker on the island, and it was rumored that it would be able to hold out for about 3 months. There were about 800 people in the bunker. There were no fewer than 500 drums filled with heavy oil, light oil, gasoline, and drinking water. Such bunkers were essentially self-sufficient fortresses, nearly impervious to anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest naval shells. The tunnel systems connecting these positions allowed Japanese troops to move around the battlefield undetected. Defenders could abandon a position under heavy attack, move through the tunnels, and emerge elsewhere to attack Americans from behind or on the flanks. This mobility made it nearly impossible for Marines to secure an area completely. Ground that seemed cleared of enemies in daytime might suddenly erupt with gunfire after dark as Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels to launch attacks. These nighttime infiltrations terrified the Marines. Japanese soldiers, often wearing soft-soled shoes to move silently, would creep into American positions to kill sentries, throw grenades into foxholes, or simply cause panic. To counter this threat, American forces began firing illumination shells constantly throughout the night. These special shells burst high in the air, then drifted down on parachutes while burning brightly, bathing the island in harsh white light. Ships offshore also trained searchlights on the beaches and front lines. The result was that darkness never truly fell on Iwo Jima. The constant illumination prevented sleep, but it also prevented Japanese infiltration from being as effective. February 23rd, D+4, dawned with clearing weather. The storm had passed, and Marines could resume full offensive operations. The 28th Regiment prepared for its final assault on Mount Suribachi. Patrols over the previous days had discovered that many of the defensive positions on the volcano were now empty or lightly held. Unknown to the Americans, Kuribayashi had ordered the Suribachi garrison to withdraw through tunnels to the northern part of the island. He considered the volcano lost and saw no point in wasting troops defending it when they could be fighting in the main defensive belt. Combat patrols from the 28th Marines began scaling Suribachi at first light, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they encountered only scattered fire. By mid-morning, a 40-man patrol commanded by Harold Schreer reached the summit crater. At approximately 10:20 hours, the Marines raised a small American flag that they had brought with them. This first flag raising received little attention at the time, though it was photographed. Several hours later, a much larger flag, measuring 2.4 by 4.5 meters, was carried to the summit. This flag had been obtained from a Navy ship and was intended to be visible from across the island. At 12:30 hours, a group of Marines and one Navy corpsman raised this second larger flag, while Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. His photograph, showing 6 men struggling to raise the heavy flagpole, would become one of the most iconic and recognizable images of the 20th century. The photograph would win the Pulitzer Prize, be reproduced on a postage stamp, and serve as the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The flag raising provided a tremendous morale boost for the Americans fighting on Iwo Jima. Marines across the island could see the flag flying from Suribachi's summit, a tangible symbol of progress. Ships offshore sounded their horns and whistles in celebration. For a brief moment, there was optimism that perhaps the battle was turning in America's favor. But the capture of Mount Suribachi, significant though it was, represented only the first step toward victory. The mountain and the surrounding area constituted perhaps 20% of the island's total area. The remaining 80%, including all of the rugged northern highlands where Kuribayashi had positioned his strongest defenses, remained to be taken. And it would be in those highlands that the Battle of Iwo Jima would truly be won or lost. On February 24th, D+5, American forces launched their assault on Airfield No. 2, located in the center of the island. This airfield, unlike the first, was still under construction when the battle began, though it was far enough along to be usable. The Japanese had planted the entire area with mines, anti-personnel mines to kill infantry, anti-tank mines to destroy vehicles, and they had also positioned anti-tank guns and artillery to cover every approach. Previous battles had shown that American tanks provided crucial support for infantry attacks, so the Japanese had made destroying tanks a priority. The result was a killing ground. American tanks attempting to support the infantry assault found themselves targeted by concealed anti-tank guns. Several were knocked out in the first hours of fighting. Marines advancing on foot triggered mines that killed or maimed them. Japanese machine guns fired from concealed positions, cutting down anyone who exposed themselves. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that tanks could not operate effectively in this area. The assault would have to be carried forward by infantrymen armed with small arms, grenades, demolition charges, and flamethrowers. These close-quarters battles were terrifying and exhausting. Marines would identify a Japanese position, usually by taking fire from it. A small team would then maneuver to assault it, using whatever cover and concealment they could find. One Marine would provide suppressing fire while others moved forward. Once close enough, they would throw grenades or satchel charges, canvas bags packed with explosives, into the position, or use flamethrowers to incinerate the defenders. Then they would move on to the next position and repeat the process. Progress was measured in tens of meters per hour. While the Center Division struggled with Airfield No. 2, the 5th Marines in the west made better progress. The terrain here, while still volcanic and difficult, was flatter and less broken than in the east. This allowed tanks to operate, and armored support made an enormous difference. By nightfall, the 5th Marines had advanced several hundred meters, the best progress of any unit that day. In the east, however, the 4th Marine Division finally cleared the quarry position that had caused so many casualties since D-Day. But even as they did so, Marines advancing beyond it encountered new defensive positions that seemed even more formidable. 3 mutually supporting strongpoints dominated the eastern highlands: a hill designated Hill 382 on military maps, a rocky outcropping that Marines nicknamed Turkey Knob, and a low basin called the Amphitheater. Together, these 3 positions formed a defensive complex that would become known as the Meat Grinder. On February 25, D+6, elements of the 4th Marine Division entered the Meat Grinder and discovered just how aptly named it was. The 3 positions provided interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Japanese defenders in concrete pillboxes and reinforced bunkers had clear views of the surrounding area. Artillery and mortars on the reverse slopes were positioned to drop shells on any American advance. Even Japanese tanks, dug into revetments up to their turrets, served as nearly indestructible pillboxes. American progress slowed to a crawl. Advances that previous days had measured in hundreds of meters were now measured in what the Marines cynically called touchdowns, advances of 100 yards or less. A company might fight all day to gain 50 meters, losing dozens of men in the process, only to be driven back by a counterattack after dark. The next morning they would attack again, taking the same ground at the same cost. The psychological toll of this attritional warfare was immense. Over the next 2 days, February 26th to 27th, D+7 and D+8, the pattern continued. The 4th Marines made repeated assaults on the meat grinder positions, but couldn't crack them. The other divisions encountered their own heavily fortified positions. Every fold in the ground seemed to conceal a Japanese strongpoint. Every cave had to be individually reduced. The Japanese defenders fought with a determination bordering on fanaticism, refusing to surrender even when their positions became untenable. On February 27th, American forces consolidated their positions, rather than attempting major advances. By this point, Marine units were exhausted and badly depleted. Companies that had landed at full strength were reduced to 30 or 40 men. Battalion commanders had no reserves left to commit. Many units were being led by sergeants or even corporals, all the officers having been killed or wounded. The tactics for reducing Japanese positions had evolved through brutal trial and error. Artillery and naval gunfire, while spectacular, proved relatively ineffective against the deeply buried bunkers. Airstrikes were similarly limited in utility. The most effective approach combined multiple weapon systems and required soldiers to close to point-blank range. A typical assault on a fortified bunker might proceed as follows. First, infantrymen would maneuver close to the position while machine guns provided suppressing fire. Once close enough, Marines with flamethrowers would spray jellied gasoline through any openings in the bunker. Simultaneously, other Marines would place satchel charges, bags containing 15 or 20 pounds of explosives, against the bunker walls or throw them through openings. When the charges detonated, they would collapse the bunker or kill everyone inside. If the bunker survived, tanks would be called forward to blast it at point-blank range with their main guns. Sherman tanks, the primary American medium tank, proved adaptable to these unusual combat conditions. Some were fitted with bulldozer blades, allowing them to bury Japanese positions by pushing earth and rock over their entrances. Others mounted flamethrowing equipment, turning them into Zippo tanks that could spray burning gasoline 150 meters. Regular gun tanks would sometimes park on top of bunkers and traverse their turrets back and forth, crushing the structure beneath their 30-ton weight. Tank crews would also deliberately drive over cave and tunnel entrances to collapse them. Japanese soldier Okoshi Haranori, one of the few survivors, later recalled his terror of American armor. Even if you pretended to die and fell over, on level ground, American trucks and tanks would drive over you. Some of the soldiers hid in foxholes to avoid being run over, but when the American tanks found a foxhole, they would roll around on top of it and crush the people inside. If they got you like that, you were doomed to gurgle until you died. February 28th, D+9, was originally supposed to be the last day of the battle according to pre-invasion planning. The reality was that victory seemed no closer than it had on D-Day. The Americans held the southern third of the island and had made inroads into the northern highlands, but the strongest Japanese positions remained untaken. Casualties continued to mount at an unsustainable rate. General Schmidt, recognizing that the eastern advance had stalled, decided to shift his focus. He ordered the 3rd Marine Division, now fully ashore, to attack in the center of the island toward the eastern coast. The objective was to split the remaining Japanese defenders into 2 isolated pockets. To support this attack, Schmidt ordered a massive artillery and air bombardment, the heaviest yet delivered on Iwo Jima. Over 100 artillery pieces, ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to massive 155mm guns, pounded the target area. Naval vessels added their firepower, with battleship shells weighing over a ton each plummeting down. Aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. The bombardment was so intense that the entire island seemed to shake. Then, at the appointed hour, the barrage lifted, and the 3rd Marines attacked. The bombardment had stunned the Japanese defenders, and for once, American forces made substantial progress. By nightfall, they had captured what remained of Airfield No. 2 and advanced several hundred meters beyond it. It seemed that perhaps overwhelming firepower, properly applied, could break the deadlock. On the next day, March 1st, D+10, American units across the island resumed offensive operations. In the north, Marines threatened the unfinished Airfield No. 3, which the Japanese had been constructing when the invasion began. In the west, the 5th Marine Division encountered a new strong point, Nishi Ridge, named after Baron Nishi Kakeichi, a famous Olympic equestrian champion who commanded the Japanese tank regiment defending this sector. Nishi Ridge was another excellent defensive position, honeycombed with caves and protected by minefields. The Japanese defenders fought with a determination bordering on fanaticism, refusing to surrender even when their positions became untenable. Slowly, however, through repeated assaults, the Marines began to gain ground. In the east, Hill 382 was partially captured after days of fighting, though Japanese defenders on Turkey Knob and in the amphitheater continued to hold out. As the battle ground on, a disturbing trend became apparent. The Marine Corps was running out of experienced leaders. Casualties among officers and senior non-commissioned officers had been particularly heavy. Young lieutenants and captains who had landed as platoon and company commanders were now commanding battalions. Sergeants commanded companies. Corporals commanded platoons. In some cases, privates found themselves leading squad-sized elements simply because everyone senior to them had been killed or wounded. These improvised leaders, often only 19 or 20 years old, rose to the challenge with remarkable courage and competence. But the loss of experienced leadership had real tactical consequences. Attacks were sometimes poorly coordinated. Units got lost or attacked wrong objectives. The pace of operations slowed as junior leaders learned on-the-job lessons that their predecessors had known. March 2, D+11, brought continued progress in the west and partial success in the east. But the central thrust that had seemed so promising bogged down. Japanese defenders on 2 hills designated 362B and 362C, named for their height in feet, were holding up the advance. These summits became the scene of brutal hand-to-hand fighting as Marines and Japanese soldiers clashed with rifles, bayonets, knives, and fists in the shattered landscape. By March 3, D+12, the battle had reached a temporary stalemate. Marine casualties were staggering, 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. Some units had suffered casualty rates exceeding 50%. The Japanese had lost approximately 14,000 men, almost all of them dead. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Kurabayashi still had approximately 7,000 troops left, but they were increasingly isolated in scattered pockets. American forces captured Nishi Ridge in the west and completely surrounded the amphitheater in the east. Progress had been made, but the cost was appalling. General Schmidt, recognizing that his Marines were exhausted, ordered a 2-day operational pause except for small local attacks to straighten the lines. This pause allowed fresh replacements to arrive from Guam. These new Marines, mostly just out of training, provided desperately needed manpower, but many had never seen combat, and integrating green troops into veteran units in the middle of a battle presented challenges. Experienced Marines had to look after the new men while continuing to fight for their own survival. The operational pause also allowed the Americans to accomplish something positive. On March 4th, a B-29 superfortress named Dynamite made an emergency landing on Airfield No. 1. The bomber had been damaged during a raid on Tokyo and couldn't make it back to the Marianas. The crew nursed their crippled aircraft to Iwo Jima and successfully landed despite the fact that combat was still raging nearby. It was the first of what would eventually be over 2,200 emergency landings by damaged B-29s on Iwo Jima, potentially saving the lives of 24,000 American airmen. The landing provided a tangible demonstration that the terrible battle was serving its intended purpose. On March 6th, D+15, the Marines resumed their offensive. A massive artillery barrage preceded the attack. American guns fired over 22,500 shells in just the first hour. But the impact proved disappointing. Many shells fell on empty positions or exploded harmlessly in the volcanic soil. Japanese defenders, sheltered in their deep bunkers, emerged after the barrage lifted to man their weapons. Marine advances measured only 50 to 100 meters across the entire front, purchased with hundreds of casualties. It had become clear to American commanders that the Japanese had figured out their tactics. Every morning, the same pattern repeated: artillery barrage, followed by infantry assault along predictable axes of advance. The Japanese simply waited out the bombardment, then emerged to meet the attack. General Graves Erskine, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, proposed a different approach: a dawn attack at 5 a.m. without preliminary bombardment. His troops would advance not straight ahead, but at an angle, into a Japanese sector that faced the neighboring 4th Division. The goal was to achieve surprise through timing and direction of attack. The experiment was tried for the first time on March 7th, D+16, and it worked brilliantly. The Japanese defenders, expecting the usual morning barrage and frontal assault, were caught off guard by Marines attacking from an unexpected direction at an unusual hour. By the end of the day, the 3rd Marines had captured Hill 362C, the last of the major Highland strongpoints. This advance began to create an isolated pocket of Japanese resistance that would become known as Cushman's Pocket, named for the Marine commander whose units contained it. But just as the Americans were celebrating this tactical success, the Japanese delivered a shock. At midnight on March 7th through 8th, Captain Inoue Samaji, commanding Japanese forces in the Tachiiwa Point area, disobeyed Kuribayashi's standing orders and launched a banzai attack. Approximately 1,500 Japanese troops, sailors, soldiers, and even wounded men from the field hospitals charged toward American lines. Some were armed with rifles and machine guns, others with bamboo spears or explosive charges strapped to their bodies, determined to die by throwing themselves under American tanks. The attack was everything Kuribayashi had forbidden: wasteful, futile, and tactically counterproductive. American machine gunners and riflemen cut down the Japanese charging in windrows. Artillery and mortars fired at pre-registered coordinates, catching the attackers in the open. Flares illuminated the battlefield, making it easy for American gunners to find targets. By dawn, the attack had completely collapsed. Over 1,000 Japanese. The banzai attack, though a tactical failure, demonstrated the desperate situation facing the Japanese garrison. Food, water, and ammunition were running low. Medical supplies were exhausted. Thousands of wounded men lay in caves and bunkers with no treatment available. The survivors knew there was no hope of relief or evacuation. They would all die on Iwo Jima. The only question was when and how. Over the next 3 days, March 8 to 10, D+17 through D+19, American forces systematically reduced the remaining Japanese positions. In the east, Marines bypassed Cushman's pocket, leaving it isolated while pushing past it toward the northern coast. The meat grinder, that complex of positions that had cost so many casualties, was finally completely overrun. On March 10th, a patrol from the 3rd Marine Division reached the northern coast of Iwo Jima, splitting the remaining Japanese defenders into separate pockets. The patrol was driven back by a Japanese counterattack, but it had achieved its symbolic purpose. The island was cut in two. General Kuribayashi, watching his command disintegrate around him, radioed to Tokyo. All surviving fighting units have sustained heavy losses. I am very sorry that I have let the enemy occupy one part of Japanese territory, but am taking comfort in giving him heavy damages. It was as close to an admission of defeat as the proud general would ever make. By March 11th, D+20, organized Japanese resistance existed in only 3 isolated areas: Cushman's pocket in the north center, scattered positions along the eastern coast, and a section of the northwest coast. Kuribayashi, with his remaining 1,500 men, withdrew to a deep gorge near the northern tip of the island. This gorge, which Marines would dub Bloody Gorge, would be the site of the battle's final phase. The Marines at this point were physically and psychologically spent. Many men were showing signs of what was then called combat fatigue and is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had fought for 3 weeks without rest exhibited the 1,000-yard stare of psychological trauma. Some were incapable of functioning in combat. Others continued to fight, but were increasingly prone to taking unnecessary risks, either from fatigue-induced carelessness or from a fatalistic attitude that they were going to die regardless. Recognizing that further frontal assaults would only waste lives to no purpose, American commanders tried a different approach. They called on the Japanese to surrender. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese, explaining that prisoners would be well treated and that further resistance was pointless. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft, and artillery shells loaded with propaganda messages were fired into Japanese-held areas. The Americans even used Japanese prisoners of war to deliver the message. One such prisoner, Momoda Hideo, wrote a letter that was reproduced and distributed throughout the remaining Japanese positions. "Comrades, I myself would never have believed that things could be this way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. At first, I was embarrassed to have been taken by the enemy, but when I learned that several officers had the same experience, I felt better. In our conversations, we agreed that it is more honorable to live for the emperor and work for a greater Japan in the future than merely to die like rats underground." These surrender appeals had minimal impact. Japanese military culture emphasized that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Soldiers had been indoctrinated since basic training that they must never allow themselves to be captured alive. Many genuinely believed the American claims of good treatment were lies designed to trick them. Others preferred death to the shame they believed capture would bring on themselves and their families. As a result, even as their situation became hopeless, most Japanese soldiers chose to fight to the death. American forces continued to advance and systematically eliminate Japanese strongpoints. By March 14th, all organized resistance ceased except in Bloody Gorge. On that day, U.S. authorities declared Iwo Jima officially secure. It was D+23, more than twice as long as the battle was originally expected to last. But declaring the island secure didn't mean the fighting was over. Kuribayashi and his remaining men continued to hold out in Bloody Gorge for another 9 days. The gorge was a nightmare of broken terrain, caves, and tunnels that formed a natural fortress. American artillery couldn't be used effectively for fear of hitting friendly units who were advancing from multiple directions. Naval gunfire was similarly restricted.
The reduction of this final strongpoint fell to Marine infantry, supported by combat engineers with explosives and flamethrowers. Marines would identify a cave or bunker entrance, then work their way close enough to attack it. Flamethrowers would spray fire into the opening. Demolition teams would place explosive charges to collapse the position or seal it permanently. In some cases, bulldozers were used to simply bury the entrances under tons of rock and earth, entombing the defenders alive. It was grim, exhausting work that continued day after day. On March 23, D+35, Kuribayashi issued his final radio message to the Japanese garrison on nearby Chichijima. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. After that, silence. Kuribayashi's ultimate fate remains unknown. It's possible he committed ritual suicide according to the samurai tradition. Some accounts suggest he led a final attack and died fighting. His body was never positively identified, though several remains found after the battle might have been his. On March 26, D+35, around 200 to 300 Japanese troops emerged from Bloody Gorge and launched a final banzai attack against Airfield No. 2. The targets were primarily airmen and construction personnel, cooks, mechanics, engineers, rather than combat infantry. The attack achieved complete surprise, and for a chaotic hour, the rear area became a battlefield. But American forces quickly rallied, and Marines rushed from nearby positions to help. By sunrise, all the attackers were dead. This final charge marked the end of the Battle of Iwo Jima. The statistics of the battle were sobering. The Marine Corps suffered approximately 23,000 casualties, including 6,800 killed in action. The Navy lost an additional 2,800 dead and wounded, mostly from kamikaze attacks on ships. These losses made Iwo Jima the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Perhaps most significantly, it was the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese troops defending Iwo Jima, over 19,000 were killed. Only 216 prisoners were taken during the battle itself, and most of those were wounded men who were unconscious when captured. In the months after the battle officially ended, American occupation forces killed or captured another 2,000 Japanese troops who had been hiding in caves and tunnels, continuing a hopeless resistance. The battle's legacy remained controversial for decades. The United States Army Air Forces and some Navy officers argued that Iwo Jima had not been worth the cost. They contended that the island's value as an emergency landing field and fighter base, while real, did not justify the casualties. Some suggested the island could have simply been bypassed, allowing the garrison to remain isolated and irrelevant. The Marine Corps and the Navy leadership disagreed. They pointed out that 2,251 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima before the war ended, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew members. P-51 Mustang fighters based on the island escorted B-29s all the way to Japan, significantly reducing bomber losses to Japanese fighters. The island served as a base for air-sea rescue operations that saved hundreds of downed airmen, and the psychological impact of capturing actual Japanese soil, while impossible to quantify, was certainly significant. More broadly, the Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated the incredible costs that would be incurred in any invasion of the Japanese homelands. If a tiny volcanic island with 21,000 defenders could cost the Americans 25,000 casualties, what would be the cost of invading Kyushu or Honshu, where millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians would resist? The casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, ran into the hundreds of thousands or even millions. Some historians have suggested that the horrific casualties at Iwo Jima and the later Battle of Okinawa influenced President Truman's decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than invade.
The battle also entered American popular consciousness in a way few military engagements have. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became instantly iconic. It has been reproduced countless times, served as the basis for the Marine Corps War Memorial, and symbolizes American determination and sacrifice in World War II. 3 of the 6 men in the photograph, Harlan Bloch, Franklin Sousley, and Michael Strank, were killed in action on Iwo Jima before the battle ended. The 3 survivors, John Bradley, Renee Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, struggled with the fame that came from the photograph, with Hayes in particular suffering from alcoholism and depression before his early death. The Battle of Iwo Jima stands as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of war. The Marines who fought there demonstrated extraordinary bravery under conditions that can barely be imagined. The Japanese defenders, whatever one thinks of the cause they fought for, displayed a determination and martial skill that earned the grudging respect of their enemies. And the thousands who died on both sides served as a reminder that war, even when necessary and just, exacts a terrible price from those who fight it. If you found this detailed historical account valuable, please take a moment to like this content, share it with others interested in military history, leave your thoughts and questions in the comments section, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss future historical deep dives. Your engagement helps us continue producing comprehensive historical content. Thank you for your time and attention to this important chapter of World War II history.